Okay, so we're discussing right now different temporary issues, and the subject we're doing is procreation, the mitzvah of pru, and in particular the different halachic issues regarding reproductive technologies, often called art-assisted reproductive technologies. And so far we've been looking at plain vanilla. By plain vanilla, I simply mean husband's sperm, wife's egg. You don't have third parties involved. And if you recall, the last thing we talked about were some common halachic problems in an IVF. And again, I'm talking about plain vanilla IVF. I'm going to review a little bit. Husband's sperm, wife's egg, and if it is fertilized, the fertilized egg gets transferred into wife's uterus. There's no other people involved. So what are the halachic issues about the IVF per se? So really there are two different halachic issues. One is procurement of sperm, because after all, if it's an IVF, that means the sperm will be procured not through marital intercourse generally. And then you run into problems of hashchasa sera, which is called the destruction of male seed, involving masturbation and the like. And there, without going over everything again, the poskim have basically said that although masturbation is normally something that's very, very forbidden because male masturbation, because of the destruction of the zera, of the sperm, here it really is working in the opposite way. The purpose of getting the sperm is in order to try to have a child. So therefore, it's the opposite of the destruction of sperm. Yes, the sperm did not come out in the course of marital relations, but it is being done for the purpose of procreation. So as a result, the poskim do allow it, but they have imposed waiting periods, at least when there's no definitive diagnosis. They have said the couple must have been married for at least 5 years and unsuccessfully have not had a child. Some even say 10 years and the like. But it would appear that waiting periods is only necessary if there's no diagnosis. I mean, if there's a definitive diagnosis that the sperm does not move fast enough, or the sperm count is so low that you need to aggregate a lot of ejaculates in order to have an in vitro fertilization, it appears there's no reason to wait if you have a definitive diagnosis of what the problem is. But be it as it may, that is issue number one. Issue number one is the sperm procurement. Issue number two is, what do you do? This is where Mamish left off. What do you do with the fertilized eggs that are more than you want to be implanted? Now, again, let me just remind you of the nature of the problem. In the normal course of events, a woman ovulates once a month and releases only one egg. One egg is released. A woman is born with all of the eggs that she will use her entire life. It's an amazing thing. Millions and millions of things. In fact, there's an amazing technology that you can actually retrieve eggs from aborted fetuses aborted female fetuses that can be used in vitro fertilization. That actually means a person's mother might be someone who was never even born.
That's not fair to the child.
No, I'm not saying it's much, and I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm just saying that even an aborted fetus has all the eggs that a fully adult woman. It's different. It's very different than sperm. Sperm literally does not exist until the boy begins to go into puberty or whatever it would be. The eggs are there, mamish, very, very soon after conception and some early embryonic development. Say again?
Is that halachically allowed?
Halachically, it's very problematical, but it's not so clear that what the issue would be. Just because, now again, the abortion might be prohibited, but that's a separate issue. But even if the abortion is prohibited, there's no prohibition necessarily in harvesting the eggs and using them for in vitro. But right now, as I say, I'm dealing with plain vanilla in vitro, meaning just the wife's egg. Now, the problem is that if you simply follow the woman's normal ovulation, that would basically mean you'd only have one egg per month. For an in vitro, and the prospects of success are very, very low with only one egg. And to keep on doing it every month is going to be very, very expensive. And insurance is going to stop paying after 2 in vitro attempts. And then it's very expensive. After that, you've got to pay. Israel is a little more generous, but even they would not allow it to be stretched out indefinitely. So as a result, all in vitro protocols involve the administration of drugs that induce what is called superovulation, meaning to say the woman is given drugs which can wreak havoc on her system. It's not an easy process in which she might ovulate and produce 10 eggs, 20 eggs that will ripen and be ready for fertilization. And then through surgery, so it's a double whammy for a woman. There's the administration of the drugs of superovulation, it's called, and then there's the surgery of extraction, which can also be very, very difficult. So as a result, for a typical in vitro, they may take out anywhere between 5 and 20 eggs to attempt to fertilize them. And the hope would be that they would get 1 or 2 that they could implant. Well, if that's what happens, then Baruch Hashem, then it's exactly fine. Meaning you take out the 20 eggs, 1 or 2 get fertilized, you implant them. But what happens if the in vitro is more successful than the doctors thought? What happens if you have, again, I'm reviewing a little bit, what happens if instead of 1 or 2 fertilized eggs, you extracted, let's say 15, and 10 of them got fertilized, 15 of them got fertilized? What are you going to do, right? Even Octomom took in 8, and that anyway is beyond what is recommended. So a woman might take, single, twins, triplets, quadruplets, even quintuplets, but beyond that, you're going, very, very difficult. So the second major halachic issue is, what do you do with embryos, fertilized eggs, not just eggs, fertilized embryos, beyond the number that one wishes to have implanted or that can safely be implanted, right? What do you do with, they often call them spare embryos, although spare is not a very respectful term. So if you remember, how there are a number of options. When a couple signs up for a fertility treatment, they'll be given a big contract. And this is a matter of secular. They'll be given a whole big contract they're going to sign. And one of the most important parts of the contract is, what do you want us to do with fertilized embryos? And they give you a lot of choices. Choice number 1, of course, is how many do you want to have implanted? And that's also an individual decision. 1, 2, 3, 4. Typically, they will not allow more than 4 to be implanted, but whatever. So that's issue number. Right, so option number 1 is implantation. Option number 2 is freezing the embryos for later implantation. And that's entirely safe, meaning let's assume there are 10 embryos that have been fertilized. The woman and her husband want to have 2 now. They'll have twins, they hope. And the other 8 can be frozen and they can be used over a number of years. So just because they were fertilized at the same time doesn't mean they have to be implanted at the same time. And halachically, of course, their age would be based on when they were born. In other words, the fact that an embryo was fertilized in 2024, but was not implanted and born until 2030, well, its birthday is going to be 2030, or whatever the Hebrew date is going to be, right? So that's option number 2, which is not controversial. So option number 1 is what you implant now. Option number 2 is freezing for later implantation, and again, that is a technology that vadai exists and the like, and normally that goes without a hitch, but even then, there may be some residual problems. I had mentioned to you, what if the freezer breaks down on Shabbos? Are you allowed to, right? You can certainly violate Shabbos to save a baby, that's for sure, right? That's pikuach nefesh. Can you violate Shabbos to save frozen embryos?
Is the place you're keeping them like a Jewish place?
Well, if they're not, then it wouldn't be right. Your responsibility. But let's assume halachically, let's say it's Shaarei Tzedek here, right? Shaarei Tzedek here has a fertility clinic. So would they be allowed? Now, obviously, they can get non-Jews to do it, which most of the time they would. But theoretically, if the only guy or the only person who knew how to fix this freezer was a Jewish person who keeps Shabbos, Are you allowed to desecrate Shabbos to save a frozen embryo? So, la halacha, it actually appears, yes, that even though it's not yet a full human being till it'll be born, but since it is a potential human being, that is enough of a justification to desecrate Shabbos. Right, so that's one issue. But freezing for later use is perfectly okay, and if the freezer breaks down, even a Jew is allowed to violate Shabbos. In fact, it's not a violation because that's called pikuach nefesh. Okay, now option number 3. So option number 1 is what you want to have implanted now. Option number 2 is freezing for later implantation, right, which is fine. Option number 3 is donation to an infertile couple. Now, this is not just sperm donation. Keep in mind, this is very different. This is not sperm donation and it's not egg donation. This is embryo donation.
So it's like they're adopting, kind of.
That's essentially an adoption, meaning genetically, this child is 100% this husband and this wife, the egg and the sperm.
Yeah.
But they want to give it to a couple so some other woman could carry. So here I had mentioned, although I'm going to develop it more today in another area, that even though this seems like very altruistic and it seems like a kind gesture, halachically it is very, very, very problematical because there's going to be a lot of uncertainty who is the mother here. Because on one hand, the genetic mother is the one whose egg was fertilized. On the other hand, there'll be a birth mother who will be somebody else if you're donating it to an infertile couple. And we're going to see it more detail a little later, probably in around 20 minutes or so. We'll get to it. That there's a lot of uncertainty if halachic motherhood is defined by genetic contribution, which means the egg, or it's defined by parturition, which is birth, gestation and birth. And that's going to be especially important if it's going to be donated to a non-Jewish woman, because Judaism, the whole Jewish religion, is based on who the mother is. And in a case like this, you don't know. There's a machlokes who the mother is, right? So if the egg donor is Jewish and the woman who carries the baby is not. Again, we'll come back to that with surrogacy. All I can say is that because of this great confusion as to who is the mother, generally speaking, Jewish law would not be encouraging of donating an embryo. Donating an embryo creates many, many halachic problems. So now the next option, again, these are options that are available. Legally, you can do all of these things. I mean, legally, if you're asking me, secular law, including the secular law of Israel, and certainly in the United States, you can certainly donate embryos. You can donate embryos. There's no law against that. But halachically, we're talking about halachically, this would not be encouraged. So the next option is, can the embryos that you don't want to implant, can they be used for scientific research? And in particular, the most common thing they would be used for in science would be the obtaining of embryonic stem cells. Again, embryonic stem cells, very, very important thing to be aware of. When a sperm fertilizes an egg and the fertilized egg begins to divide, first you have 1 cell, then 2 cells, then 4 cells, then 8 cells. Initially, those cells are not yet differentiated, meaning you don't have brain, kidney, liver, heart. You just have cells. They haven't become anything yet. Eventually, after a few weeks, they begin to differentiate. They begin to specialize. Then you see a heart, you see the beginning of a heart, liver, spinal cord, everything else. So stem cells are simply cells in an undifferentiated state that have not yet assumed an identity. Now, this is really quite amazing because what this really means is, in every cell of the human body is actually the DNA of every part of the human body. So, for example, take a skin cell. Now, the skin cell is skin, but it actually has DNA for liver, for heart, for brain, for kidney. But at some point in embryonic development, those things turn off and only the skin DNA gets activated. In a heart cell, it's the same thing. In every heart cell, there is the DNA of kidney, of liver, of brain, of skin. But that shuts off and only the heart cell DNA gets activated. But it's all there. There. That's when it doesn't switch off properly, that is actually one of the situations of cancer. I mean, cancer essentially is when things are not shut off that should have been shut off in various ways. So this isn't a wondrous thing. Like, this is, if you think about this, this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Like, who tells the skin cell to become skin instead of something else? Who says the kidney becomes kidney? Because everything is everything. In every part, it's a Kabbalistic idea, in every part there is the whole. The whole of the organism is in every part of the organism. So stem cells really represents the unlimited potential. It hasn't yet become differentiated. So around 30 or so years ago, these stem cells were harvested from early embryos, and they were able to be cultured. So you could take like 10 stem cells from an embryo and turn them into 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 stem cells. And then they could be coaxed in various ways to become any one of more than 200 different types of tissue or different types of cells. So it could be used for heart valve replacement. It could be used for spinal cord tissue. It could be used even for brain cells, for various types of brain damage. In fact, even to this very day, stem cells may have a role in Alzheimer's, treating Alzheimer's and dementia and the like. Very, very miraculous. Now, the truth is, stem cells exist in different parts of your body. There are stem cells in bone marrow. There are stem cells in placenta when a woman gives birth. But embryonic stem cells are the stem cells in an early fertilized embryo within, I think, around 2 weeks or so. Now, the problem is with embryonic stem cells is that when you obtain the stem cells, you also kill the embryo. So, for example, the Catholic Church, which, as everybody knows, is very, very much against abortion, prohibits the harvesting of embryonic stem cells because they say, hey, just because the embryo is 2 weeks old, you're killing a human embryo by harvesting stem cells. Therefore, the Catholic Church prohibits not only abortion of a baby, but they prohibit the harvesting of embryonic stem cells. Now, whether you could use the stem cells once the embryo has been harvested, that's another question. But the actual harvesting would be considered to be abortion. I'll talk about halacha in a moment. Now, just to keep this in perspective, do you know, again, this doesn't change anything necessarily, but I think it's good to have a picture here. Embryonic stem cells are harvested from an embryo within 14 days of fertilization. Do you know what an embryo looks like at 14 days after fertilization? Take your pen, make a thick dot. So it's not microscopic. Make a thick dot on the piece of paper. And that is an embryo at 14 days from fertilization. Right? So that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, dismembering an 8-month-old baby or whatever it is. We're talking about something the size of a thick pencil point. Okay, so the Catholic Church, we know that position, but this class is not about teaching you the teachings of the Catholic Church. Our concern is, what would the Torah say about harvesting embryonic stem cells? So, is it abortion? That's really the question. I'm going to talk about abortion more biarichos later, but right now I can just say the simple idea. Jewish law normally does not allow abortion. Okay, we'll talk about the exceptions, but normally it doesn't allow abortion. Normally, I think it's safe to say that. Although there are exceptions, of course. So the question is, if you live within a halachic realm that says abortion is normally not something you do, are we going to extend the abortion halachos to the harvesting of embryonic stem cells? So let's see here. There is a view in halacha that actually says all abortion is permitted if it is within 40 days of conception. Where do you get that idea? We get that idea from a statement in the Talmud that says every embryo within 40 days of conception is deemed mere water. It's not developed enough to count for anything. It is mere water. That's the phrase. The Talmud says, the Gemara says that. Now, here is something very important. It's extremely important that whenever somebody gives you a quote from the Talmud, even if the quote is accurate, even if the quote is 100% accurate, you need to look at the context in which the quote was made. Because statements are made in certain contexts and they're not necessarily translatable to another context. For example, let's take this quote. Is there a statement in the Gemara that embryos less than 40 days are considered mere water? Absolutely. That is an accurate quote. But what is it talking about? It is not talking about abortion. It is talking about something else. What is it talking about? According to Parshas Tazria and Chumash Vayikra, when a woman gives birth to a child or even miscarries, she must bring a sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash, even for a miscarriage, whether it's a live birth or a miscarriage. And when does she bring it? So if it was a boy, it's the 41st day after childbirth. If it's a girl, it's the 81st day after childbirth, whatever it is. Now, the Talmud says, however, that certain early miscarriages are so early, the embryo is so underdeveloped, that it doesn't have the status of a birth or even a stillbirth that would require a korban. And among those cases is a woman that miscarries within 40 days of conception. The truth of the matter is, that is so early that normally a woman would not even know. I mean, think about it. A woman normally doesn't even know she's pregnant necessarily that early. And it's just a discharge. A person might look at it like a menstrual discharge. But even if somehow it was known that this was a pregnancy, but a pregnancy earlier than 40 days, so to speak, doesn't count. And if it doesn't count, there is no korban. Now, it's not talking about abortion, but some poskim have said, well, if the fetus, or actually it's not called the fetus, but if the embryo is so underdeveloped that it doesn't count as a person for purposes of korban, then perhaps we would allow abortion of it as well, because it's not yet a developed human being. So some poskim do indeed take the position that there is a heter of abortion within 40 days of conception. There is such a shita that says this, and this would allow things like the morning after pill, right? People have intercourse, and perhaps there was a pregnancy, and the morning after pill actually is an abortion pill because it causes the embryo to be uprooted from the uterine wall. And even though technically it's an abortion, but it's the day after, so obviously it's less than 40 days. So some would allow that. Now, If you follow that lenient opinion, then embryonic stem cell retrieval would certainly be permitted because you're doing it not only within 40 days of conception, you're doing it within 2 weeks of conception. Because after 2 weeks, the cells begin to differentiate. So, heter number 1 for the harvesting of embryonic stem cells would simply be the halacha that permits any abortion within 40 days of conception. So the harvesting of embryonic stem cells is within 40 days of conception. It is within 14 days of conception. So that would work. But the problem is, not everyone acknowledges such a heter. There are poskim that actually are very strict. Moshe Feinstein was strict. I believe the Rebbe himself was strict on this. That abortion is going to be prohibited from the time of conception, and it does not depend on the 40 days. And the Talmudic statement that the 40 days is like mere water is only referring to the korban, and you cannot generalize it beyond that context. So here's the problem. If you follow the view that 40 days is not a heter, and the morning after pill would not be permitted, unless it's, the mother's life is in danger, that's another thing. We'll talk about that. Again, I'm not, right now, again, I don't want to give you the impression that abortion itself doesn't have exceptions. It does, and we will talk about it. But I'm just, the only question I'm focusing on right now is a narrow question, and that is, to what degree will the harvesting of embryonic stem cells be considered the same as abortion? That's the only question I'm really dealing with. The Catholic Church equates it identically in terms of halacha, so I said one side of it. If you matir abortion within 40 days, then certainly you will matir the harvesting of embryonic stem cells. Question is, what if you took the position like Moshe Feinstein, and I believe like the Rebbe himself, that the Gemara's context is limited to the sacrifice, and it is not referring to abortion, the sanctity of life must be respected immediately? Would there be a heter of harvesting embryonic stem cells? So some would say no. Some would say you're not allowed to do it, right? But others say the following. Others say that the laws against abortion, even if they start immediately, only apply once the embryo is in the womb, because it's in the environment in which it will eventually become a life. You see, an embryo in a petri dish, an embryo in a test tube, can never, now this may change actually, but right now, can never become a life. If it is not implanted or at least frozen within a few days, it's just going to die. The cells are going to die. So the argument goes that the laws of abortion in halacha apply when the embryo is in a matzav, it's in a situation where it can become a life. And until it is in that situation, even like Rav Moshe Feinstein and the Rebbe, neither of them addressed this issue, unfortunately, so we don't know what they would say. But the argument is, even they might say, at least, that outside of the mother's womb, there is no abortion prohibition. Now, I hope I'm not confusing you too much, but bottom line, let's swing back. So, if husband and wife have what are called spare embryos, and they want to donate the embryos for the retrieval of stem cells, which can be used in life-saving medical research. It's a very worthy cause. So the question becomes, are they allowed to do that? Are they allowed to authorize the destruction of those embryos for the retrieval of stem cell research? Answer, like the opinions who permit abortion within 40 days of conception, for sure it's okay. But even the opinions who prohibit abortion within 40 days of conception might allow this because the embryos are externalized and they're not yet in the mother's womb. So many poskim do allow it. And now many poskim allow, as it were, pre-implantation destruction of embryos for stem cell research. So that would be an available option. Now, again, if this question ever comes up, you do have to talk to a flesh and blood rabbi about this, because don't make the decision based on the class that you heard on it. But this would be the halachic issue. Of course, the question then becomes, well, how far are you going to take this? In other words, I'm basically telling you now that there's a strong halachic position that the laws of abortion do not apply to unimplanted embryos. I mean, that's essentially the position, that until it's in the mother's body, you can destroy it. Well, let's test that proposition. Can you destroy it for any reason? I understand. In the case that we're talking about, you're destroying it to have life-saving stem cell retrieval. What if you want to destroy it because they're female embryos instead of boys, or boys instead of girls, or different minor reasons, right? Blue eyes, I don't know how much you could tell. Through genetic analysis, you determine various things. I mean, can you destroy these things for any reason whatsoever? Well, according to the logic of the position I'm espousing, the answer would be yes. But something sounds not right here. Something sounds not right that for insignificant reasons, you can simply destroy.
Intention matters.
Say again?
Intention matters.
Yeah. The question is, it's not so easy to translate that into a halachic prohibition. That's really the problem. But at least if it's something like embryonic stem cells, which is a very, very significant medical benefit to people, we would be able to invoke this lenient view. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I want to apply this to abortion. So I'm going to switch the case here. Many of you might be familiar with Dor Yesharim. Are you familiar with Dor Yesharim? Yes, Dor Yesharim has been around since the 1970s, the advent of genetic testing. It started with just only one illness that they were testing, but now it's expanded. Some people are critical of the expansion. It started with Tay-Sachs, right? Tay-Sachs is a childhood disease that is predominantly among Jews of Ashkenazi descent. So we both have Tay-Sachs and also lactose intolerance. Those are the two Ashkenazi curses. And of those two, Tay-Sachs is by far much, much, much worse. And it requires that if both parents have to be genetic carriers, if only one parent carries the gene, there'll be no problem. But if both parents carry the gene, there is a 1 in 4 chance, 1 in 4, that they will have a child that will have the actual sickness. Now, Tay-Sachs to date is incurable, and it's a very, very awful disease. There's a lot of pain, a lot of gradual loss of functioning. Eventually, the child is deaf and blind, and it's very similar in a lot of ways to also Lou Gehrig's disease, losing movement and control. And typically, like I don't know for sure. I don't have the recent numbers, but I don't think there's any survivors beyond 10. Typically, death will occur between 5 and 10, very young. Now, we can screen people for Tay-Sachs just as we can for the Tay-Sachs gene, just as we can for many, many conditions. So in the 1970s, this is before doctors were doing it. This is before hospitals were doing it routinely. So this was a private organization in which Jewish people, boys and girls, men and women who were dating, were encouraged to be genetically tested for the Tay-Sachs gene. And the way it would work is they actually wouldn't give you the results. They would just simply give the man and the woman compatible or not compatible. Now, if they gave you a compatible, you don't know if you have the gene or not, because maybe you have it and the other person doesn't, or the other person has it and you don't. Now, if they tell you not compatible, you knew for sure both of you had the gene. Right, so the idea was that the purpose of this genetic testing was to prevent people from marrying who genetically have a 1 in 4 chance of producing children with this awful childhood illness, and in that way would prevent the spread of the illness. It would prevent a tremendous amount of misery. Now, there were people there were even rabbis who were against this concept because they basically said, you have to rely on God, rely on Hashem. What are you second guessing? Hashem will give you what you're supposed to have. But Rav Moshe Feinstein and other Gedolim did take the position that halachically we are allowed to take precautions to avoid serious genetic illness. And this should be done early because once you're on the verge of getting engaged, you're emotionally involved, it's much more difficult to have to break up. So Tay-Sachs was encouraged, in fact, today I can tell you, I know people, I have no children of marital age right now, but I know people who will not go out on a date unless there's Dor Yesharim testing. So basically, it's like, the girl's family will ask, was the boy tested? The boy's family asks, was the girl's tested, etc. Now, as I say, Dor Yesharim started with only one illness, Tay-Sachs. If you've looked at Dor Yesharim now, there's something like 200 different things there. And many people say it's going much, much, much too far because it's going for deafness, it's going for all sorts of different things, obesity. They have predictors of obesity and the like. At some point, when you're trying to have the perfect child, the perfect marriage, the perfect this, at some point Hashem shows you that things are not always perfect. So many people are questioning extreme genetic testing for all sorts of problems, some of which are not even that serious. And they feel it should be limited to something like Tay-Sachs. Okay, be it as it may. But the thought experiment I want to raise here is the following. Let's imagine a husband and a wife did not do Dor Yesharim. And after they get married, they discover they are both carriers of the Tay-Sachs gene. They discover it after they're married. And that means there's a 1 in 4 chance that they will have a child who will die a horrible death, young. So what are their options? Again, I just want to go through this. This is not, by the way, this is not an unrealistic scenario. These cases actually happen. So what are their choices right now when they both discover after their marriage that they are, let's say, Tay-Sachs carriers? So let's just list them and then we'll ask ourselves, what would halacha say about each of these options? Option number 1, get divorced. Meaning, get divorced and marry somebody who's not a carrier. You avoid the problem that way. Well, that would avoid the problem, but maybe only at the expense of a much greater problem. If indeed there's a good marriage, if indeed they love each other, halacha would be very, very reluctant to say that they have to get divorced. We don't want people to get divorced unless they're not allowed to be. If it's a Jew married to a non-Jew, we would like them to get divorced. If a Kohen is married to a divorced woman, we would like them to get divorced. But here, it's a medical condition. And even though divorce is possible, we would not necessarily consider it to be the best solution. Okay, so we look at other possibilities. Possibility 2, permanent contraception. Let's just not have kids. Or maybe we'll adopt. We don't want to bring kids into the world who may have serious genetic conditions. Well, that's a problem. To simply stipulate up front that we're not going to try to have children in our marriage is at a minimum a violation of the mitzvah of pruervu. Right? There's a mitzvah, at least on the man, to have children. So you can't just say, let's not have kids. There's a mitzvah of pruervu. Moreover, it's also short-sighted because 1 out of 4 will get sick, but that actually means there's a 75% chance that any given child will be healthy. So it's like you're shutting off everything because of the 25% chance. So permanent contraception would not be recommended either. Option 3, let's go with the pregnancy. And for every pregnancy, we will do an amniocentesis. That means a big needle injected in the woman's womb. And looking at the amniotic fluid, it can be determined if there's a birth defect or whatever it is. And if there's amniocentesis, or maybe you could tell by some other, maybe less invasive ways, abortion, meaning we'll abort the Tay-Sachs babies. And if it's not a Tay-Sachs baby, we'll bring it to term, right? So we'll call this option selective abortion. So let's ask ourselves this question. Does halacha allow the abortion of a baby because of severe genetic defects, like Tay-Sachs or genetic illnesses? So here, in the 1960s, this was a huge machlokas. Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who I mentioned before, just to remind you, he was very lenient. He was the one that permitted hugging and kissing of adopted children. Adopted parents are allowed to have hug and kiss adopted children. Well, he also took the position that Tay-Sachs abortions were permitted because of the great suffering of the child until the last trimester, meaning you could abort a Tay-Sachs baby until the conclusion of 6 months. This was his position. But Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Rebbe, like virtually everybody else, they considered this to be a horrendous avera. Rabbi Feinstein even had the language, must forgive. May God forgive Rav Oldenburg for allowing such a psak. And because of this, Rav Moshe Feinstein was even against amniocentesis in the first place. Because what's the purpose of testing genetic abnormalities in the fetus if you're not going to be able to do anything as a result? Maybe it's better not to know. And then God might do miracles in the womb. Right there, there's a mystical idea in Judaism.
I want to ask 2 questions.
Yeah, let me just say, there's a mystical idea in Judaism that once you know there's a medical problem, you cannot expect a miracle by God to take it away. So, for example, if a person knew that the fetus was Down syndrome, you can't pray to God to take it away. But until you know, it's still unknown. Even though it's knowable, but you don't know, you can ask Hashem to change things. So,
You can't know what to change if you don't know what it is to change.
well, you basically say, if there's any, it's very general. If there's anything bad, please change it. So Rav Moshe Feinstein argued, what are you checking around? You're checking around that maybe there's this problem and that with amniocentesis. There's this problem and that problem and that problem, but you can't do anything about it. So if you can't do anything about it, you're not allowed to abort. Abortion is forbidden. Then it's better not even to know. So I've gone through, I think, 3 options so far for the Tay-Sachs couple. One is divorce, which isn't great. The third is permanent contraception, which is childless marriage, which is a violation of the mitzvah of be fruitful and multiply. Third is selective abortion through amniocentesis of a Tay-Sachs baby, according to most opinions, other than Rabbi Waldenberg and the Tzitz Eliezer. That is prohibited abortion. You certainly cannot do that. Now, 4th option, I will call the option of the righteous. That is, the option of the righteous is, I'm not going to change a thing. My wife and I will be married. We will stay together. We will have children. We will not define ourselves by statistics, because even 1 out of 4 doesn't mean every 4th child you'll have. Hashem could change the numbers on you. Or if God gives us the challenge, we will take the challenge, right? A person of bitachon says.
It's not a challenge for them. It's about the kid. Like, they're not the ones dying. I mean, it is on top of that, but it's not. They're not the ones dying in excruciating
Right.
death.
So that's the question. Would the neshama? Okay, that's a good question too. Would the neshama rather be born in pain or not be born at all? That's really the question. In other words, essentially, your decision will be: I don't want this child to have all of this pain and all of this suffering. Therefore, we'll make it that he won't be born, right? So the question becomes, in terms of the neshama, what is better for the neshama, right? That's the problem. This is called, even in philosophy, this is called the problem of non-existence. Meaning, if a person had a choice to be born healthy or be born sick, they would choose to be born healthy. But if a person is given a choice, be born sick or don't be born, right? That's not such an easy situation. It is true that the Gemara says about everybody, better for man not to have been born at all. Right? There's a Gemara like that. But as the Baal HaTanya, the Alter Rebbe himself explains, that just means it would be easier because I wouldn't face all the challenges of life. But the truth of the matter is, being born and be able to serve Hashem and be able to be Misake and all sorts of things. So that's the issue. So the tzaddik would say, I'm leaving it to God. I'm leaving it to Hashem. I'm not going to birth control. I'm not going to do abortion. I'm not going to do divorce. I will take what Hashem gives me and I will make it good. So that might be the highest level, but realistically, not everybody can live on that level. Sometimes it'll break a person. Of course, even within that level, there are different options. Sometimes a family cannot raise a child with special needs, but they could give up the child for adoption, which is an act of love. Meaning, within the idea that I will take what Hashem gives me, there is I will raise them, or I'll make adoption, I'll make a home for them, or whatever. But so how many options? As I mentioned, divorce. I mentioned permanent childlessness, selective abortion, accepting what Hashem gives you. So those are 4 choices. So now I'm going to mention a 5th choice, which ties in to what we discussed, and that is the couple wants to have children, but they feel that they're not on the madrega and they don't want a child to suffer. They don't want to bring a child into the world who will suffer this horrible death. So how about this? How about we do all of our pregnancies through in vitro fertilization? Husband's sperm, wife's egg. The eggs are fertilized. We then examine the eggs the embryos, microscopically, and we can determine pre-implantation if there is a genetic condition like Tay-Sachs. Now, if you follow the halachic ruling I said earlier, that the laws against abortion do not apply pre-implantation. This is called pre-implantation genetic screening, PGS. Pre-implantation genetic screening would seem to be a way that halacha would allow the couple to control their situation without running afoul of abortion laws, halachos, and without running afoul of the mitzvah of pru or vu. So if you matter, in other words, the same heter for the retrieval of embryonic stem cells would apply to pre-implantation genetic screening. So it actually creates an interesting option for the Tay-Sachs. But once again, you'd have the same question I raised before. Well, can I do that for baldness? Can I do that for obesity? Can I do that for all sorts for sex selection? Or does it have to be something like Tay-Sachs, something very, very serious? Can I do that for Down syndrome? Down syndrome itself is a very, very interesting phenomenon. There are people, I don't mean it from Jews, I'm talking about in society generally, they will abort a fetus because of Down syndrome. And yet, if you think about it, again, I don't know if anyone here has siblings, and forgive me if I don't mean to be insensitive in any way, But Down syndrome kids have a wide diversity. Many of them are very high functioning. Many of them can be intelligent. Many of them can contribute a lot to the world. And of course, maybe it's a stereotype, but often people remark on the happy personality and the like. And they can live with relative competence for 40, 50, or even 60 years. So do you abort somebody and take away, potentially? Again, Tay-Sachs is a different Matthias. Tay-Sachs, you're talking about a short-term survival in the face of great pain and suffering. That's a very different situation than somebody who has certain mental retardation limitations but can live a happy and productive life for 40 or 50 years. In other words, you can't, people just say, oh, I believe in abortion for severe genetic conditions. Well, the word genetic conditions is a very, very wide term. To put Down syndrome and Tay-Sachs even in the same sentence actually does not make a lot of sense, even though people do it. Or another example is something like Huntington's disease. There are diseases that have what are called a very long latency period, meaning they don't even manifest themselves till you're 50 years old. But we can see the genetic marker all the way early. So if you abort or even pre-implantation genetic screening because of a disease that's not going to even make itself known until 50 years later, well, how are you going to feel if 35 years later they discover a cure for it? I mean, you're making a judgment, I don't mean you, but the person's making a judgment that because this embryo is going to get this serious illness in 50 years, we should terminate it now? What about the 50 years of life? And what about the possibilities of cure? And what about Mashiach and everything else? Okay, so you got to be very, very careful. But Tay-Sachs, as I said, may be a candidate, not for abortion, again, not for abortion, but for pre-implantation genetic screening. Yeah.
If you do Dor Yesharim and everything is compatible, does that mean, like, could you still have kids with genetic?
Yes. This is the other thing to keep in mind. There are such a thing in medicine, in life, as spontaneous mutations. You can have two parents who are not carriers. It's rare, it's not common, Baruch Hashem, but you can have two parents who are not carriers, who have a kid who has a spontaneous mutation and has Tay-Sachs. I saw an article about this. Someone actually wrote this. Says, we did Dor Yesharim, we did all the testing, and then they had a child with this machala. So there's no assurance. I'll give you another example. It's from Women's Health. There is this is a big controversy about being screened for the breast cancer gene, BRCA, BRCA, BRCA1, BRCA2, that women with a certain gene have a much higher chance of getting breast cancer. So there's a big machlokas in the medical community. Should women be screened for this particular gene? Now, some have made the point that, even if you don't have the gene, you can still get the cancer. And even if you have the gene, it's possible not to get the cancer. In other words, this is a gene that indicates a higher probability. So some have said that screening is not a great idea because if you have the gene, you get overly frightened. And if you don't have the gene, you get overly confident and you don't take the steps of health and diet and exercise, whatever it is. You don't take the steps that can prevent these cancers because you're so overconfident that you think nothing will ever happen to you, when in fact medically that's not true. So Dor Yesharim is kind of the same way. The clear bill of health doesn't mean there aren't going to be complications. Okay, everyone has the general idea. Okay, all right. So now we're swinging back to the in vitro fertilization, and once again, just to encapsulate, the two primary problems is the procurement of the sperm, and what do you do with the spare embryos, and we talked about all of that. But all of this is what we call plain vanilla in vitro. meaning all you've done is husband's sperm and wife's egg, and the wife carries the baby, right? Call it plain vanilla. There are no third parties that are involved. Yeah.
Just a question. Since this would be allowed, like you said, would be allowed to harvest the stem cells, because then it's not, like, I guess, considered abortion, then how come we would be allowed to break Shabbos?
That's a very excellent question. That actually is a question. I don't have the answer. In other words, that's a contradiction in halacha. Again, just to be sure everyone understands the question here. On one hand, you're telling me, or I said, you're allowed to destroy an embryo to retrieve stem cells, because until the embryo is in the mother's womb, it is not called a life. But then I told you before, if the freezer breaks down with the frozen embryos, we are allowed to desecrate the Shabbos to save a life. But if it's not a life, then why am I allowed to desecrate Shabbos? In other words, there's a contradiction in these two halachos, permitting the desecration of Shabbos and allowing you to terminate. So it's a very excellent question. It's a good question. It doesn't seem to be consistent. I did not see a good answer, but the question is asked in that way. Okay, so now I'm going to move into the involvement of third parties. Now, one aspect of third parties I already mentioned earlier, I don't want to repeat the whole thing, and that is sperm donors. But today, we're not going to talk about sperm donors. We talked about that already. We're going to talk about donors of the female material, so to speak. And this can come in two varieties. We have egg donation, and we have surrogacy. Now, it's important that you define your terms. I mean, a term like surrogacy, surrogate motherhood, surrogacy. Surrogacy can take different forms. There is what is called full surrogacy, and there is what is called gestational surrogacy. Full surrogacy basically means husband gets nothing from his wife, meaning an egg is extracted from a woman who agrees to carry the baby. Husband's sperm fertilizes that woman's egg in vitro, and that woman carries the baby. So in full surrogacy, the surrogate is both the egg donor and the birth mother. In other words, husband's sperm fertilizes surrogate's egg, and the egg is then transferred to the surrogate. That's called full surrogacy. Now, there is a surrogacy that's split in the sense that one woman, in other words, again, the wife has nothing to do, in other words, the wife had nothing to do with full surrogacy, and I'll give you a second case where the wife has nothing to do with it, but it's split, and that is, egg comes from one woman, husband's sperm fertilizes the egg, and it is carried by another woman. So here you have egg donor woman and surrogate woman. That's another type of surrogacy, but there too, the wife has nothing to do with it. The wife is not a genetic contributor in any way. So whether it's full surrogacy or split surrogacy, in the first two cases I gave you, the wife is not involved. But the third category, which is called gestational surrogacy, actually the wife is involved. That would mean the egg is taken from the wife. The wife goes through the hormones. The wife goes through the superovulation. The wife goes through the egg retrieval. Her husband's sperm fertilizes the wife's egg. But let's assume the wife has a hysterectomy, or the wife has a medical condition where she would be unable to carry the baby. So the baby will be carried by another woman, a surrogate. Now that is not full surrogacy because the egg comes from the wife. It's gestational surrogacy, meaning the surrogate is simply carrying the baby to term. Okay, so when we ask, what does halacha say about surrogacy, we have to be very, very specific. Which surrogacy are we talking about? So, when it comes to the first case of full surrogacy, that means the surrogate's egg is fertilized and it is then implanted in the surrogate woman who brings the baby to term. In a sense, there is no debate who the mother is. The mother is 100% the surrogate. That's for sure. And that means if the surrogate is not Jewish, the child is not Jewish and has to be converted like an adopted child. Okay, that's not a debatable proposition. But the question, and of course if it's gestational surrogacy, this is where you get a serious question. Again, what do I mean by gestational surrogacy? The egg comes from the wife. Husband's sperm fertilizes the egg. And then the fertilized embryo is transferred to a woman to carry. And there's an agreement between the families that the woman will turn over the baby. We'll discuss what if she breaks the agreement, and of course that's happened. There's been some famous court cases. But the first halachic question is, who is the mother? Who is the halachic mother in the case of gestational surrogacy? Now, why is that important? Well, one reason why it's important, it's not the only reason, is that Judaism is matrilineally based. Whether a child is Jewish or not Jewish depends on their mother, not their father. Okay, remember that Jewish law, halacha, rejects the idea of being a half Jew. Right, in secular society, people say, oh, I'm half Jewish. And they can mean one parent is Jewish, whatever it is. Judaism is, in this way, an all or nothing religion. There's no such thing as being a half Jew. If your mother is Jewish, you're 100% Jewish, even if your father's not Jewish. And if your mother is not Jewish, you're 100% not Jewish, even if your father's Jewish. There is no concept at all in Judaism of being a half Jew. And everything is based on the mother, not the father. Once you're Jewish, your father determines, are you Kohen, Levi? Yeah, so there is a patrilineal aspect once your Jewishness has been defined. But what makes you Jewish is totally the mother, right? Everyone knows that. Now, I know that the Reform movement, more than 40 years ago, adopted an alternative, either matrilineal or patrilineal, and that is the stance of the Reform movement, but that is not a halachic position. Halachic position is totally matrilineal, and if your mother is not Jewish, the only way you can become Jewish is by conversion, which is also an avenue that's open. Okay, so that's fine. But the question is, what makes a mother a mother? Now, I know, of course, motherhood is love and affection, but halacha does not use that. Halacha has to look at the biology of things. In the case of gestational surrogacy, you quite literally have a definitional conundrum. Who is the mother? Wife contributed the egg, which contains 50% of the genetic material of the child. Whether it's eye color, hair color, height, intelligence, that came from the egg donor. which is the wife in this case, right? The wife is the contributor of the egg. The surrogate, on the other hand, nurtured the embryo for 9 months and gave birth. So, if we assume husband and wife are Jewish, that's our starting off aspect, and they employ a non-Jewish surrogate, if the motherhood is defined by the egg donor, the child is Jewish. When I say egg donor, I mean the wife. If, on the other hand, the mother is defined by the birther, the child is not Jewish, is essentially an adopted child with a Jewish father, but that doesn't count, and the child would have to be converted. So this is a huge question. Is the child Jewish? In the case of gestational. Now again, if it's full surrogacy, you understand this. If it's full surrogacy, there is no question. Full surrogacy, the birth mother is the genetic mother. That's not the question. But when you have gestational surrogacy, who is the halachic mother here? So one reason why that's important is Jewish versus not Jewish. But the truth of the matter is, even if they're both Jewish, it's still important in terms of who is the mother. Meaning, you still have the question, who is the halachic mother? That would refer to, for example, could he marry siblings of his birth mother? Right? Could the boy marry a daughter of the gestational surrogate? Well, if his birth mother is his mother, then her daughter is his half-sibling, his sister. But if his birth mother is not his mother, his halachic mother is the genetic mother, then he's technically not related. So, in other words, the point I'm making is, this is not only a question of Jewish versus not Jewish. It's literally a question of siblings. Which siblings can he marry or not marry based on that?
Also his Hebrew name.
Huh?
Hebrew name also. Not as important, but
His Hebrew name?
like the kid's Hebrew name.
Well, that wouldn't change. His Hebrew name would be whatever name he was given.
No,
But-
I'm saying
When he's sick,
then,
yeah.
whatever.
Well, the question is who's his mother. So the question, we normally don't use the mother's name except when he's sick. But you're correct.
Right.
If God forbid he would be sick, and you have to say Misha Beirach, and yes, that's what you mean. When you say Misha Beirach, you use the mother's name. So which would you use, right? If the wife, the genetic mother, his name is Rivka, and the birth mother, if she's Jewish, is Chaya, would it be Chaya? Would it be Rivka? Would you say both names, Chaya v'Rivka, the ben Chaya v'Rivka? Okay. So, as you would expect, there is a lot of machlokas about this. The halacha is not so certain. But a majority of poskim actually say something that might surprise you. They actually say, see, if you simply had to guess what you thought the halacha would be, many people would look at the genetic mother as the ikar, because after all of the characteristics come from the genetic mother. But in point of fact, halacha puts an enormous chashivas, an enormous importance on gestation and birth. And they actually say, therefore, the child would be treated as the halachic child of the birth mother. And part of it goes back to a bit of Kabbalah. And again, if you learned the first page of Tanya, the very, very thing that the Tanya begins with, you'd be familiar with this. The idea that before a child is born, a malach, when the child is in the mother's womb, teaches the child the whole Torah and makes the child, the unborn child, take a shavua, take an oath to be a tzaddik, to be righteous, and not to be a rasha, meaning there is some aspect of the godly soul that comes in through the process of pregnancy and birth. So even though that may not be reflected in physical biology, even though the physical DNA, so to speak, may come from the egg donor, in point of fact, the spiritual nature of the soul may be connected to pregnancy and birth. So it's a machlokes, so to speak, but by the majority of poskim would actually say the birth mother has the status of the mother, huh?
The split surrogacy also?
I didn't hear you.
The split surrogacy.
Yeah, so the same thing was, again, the same thing it would be with split. In other words, split surrogacy would simply mean I look at the birth mother. I ignore genetics in favor of birth, because although genetics may define the biology and the physiology, but the pregnancy and the birth are essentially the spiritual nature.
So then the wife, let's say, that mother would be like an adopted mother?
That's correct, which would mean, strangely enough, although the child was born from her egg, she has the status of an adoptive parent, not a birth parent. Her husband, however, would have the status of a father because he is the father. But on the other hand, if the child needed conversion, so even his paternity would be cut off through the conversion process, and therefore it would be both parents would be adopted in that way. But okay. But if both are Jewish, if both women are Jewish, then the father clearly has paternity, and the like. Now, this raises some interesting problems. Okay, so if the surrogate is not Jewish, our conclusion is the kid would need conversion. Right? Okay. If the surrogate is Jewish, the kid is Jewish, of course, but the mother is the birth mother rather than the genetic donor, according to most opinions. So here's a question. Should the surrogate be a single woman? Or should the surrogate be a married woman, or is there any problem with the surrogate being a married woman? Now, you may recall when we discussed sperm donors, I had mentioned the position of the Satmar Rebbe, so you have to remember this, who said that when a married woman is impregnated with sperm from a man other than her husband, that is treated as adultery, and the child that's born is a mamzer. Now, this is not sperm donation, this is the husband's sperm, but it's the same type of problem if the surrogate is not Jewish. Now, this is a little different, because here the sperm is not being inserted into the woman's body. It's being done through an IVF. And it's the embryo that's being put into the woman's body. But is there a possible argument by analogy that would be called adultery and the kid would be a mamzer? You see at least the possibility here. Mm-hmm. So the Rabbanut here in Eretz Yisrael, when the Knesset passed a law in Israel on surrogacy, and something that would never be done in the United States, they ran it by the Rabbanut. They wanted the Rabbanut to approve this law. And the Rabbanut requires that a surrogate can only be used if the surrogate is single and the surrogate is not an incestuous relative. Now, this is actually very important. Let me give a few examples of this. If you read about the women who volunteer to be surrogates, you will commonly see that sisters will volunteer to be surrogates for their sisters. And sometimes a mother will volunteer. If she's a young mother, a mother may volunteer to be a surrogate for her daughter who had a hysterectomy or something. Now, halachically, you can't do that. Because if husband's sperm is going to impregnate his mother-in-law's egg, that may be considered incestuous with his mother-in-law, and the kid might be a mamzer. Or if husband's sperm is going to impregnate, well, I misspoke. It. Okay. I'm skipping a few steps. I shouldn't skip it. In the case of full surrogacy, for sure, there's this problem. Meaning to say, where husband's sperm is impregnating mother-in-law's egg, and mother-in-law will carry the baby. That's full. That for sure is a potential incest problem. And the same thing is true if husband's sperm impregnates his wife's sister's egg that she carries, because the Torah says a man is not allowed to have relations with his wife's sister. So that you get, right? In other words, to use mother-in-law or wife's sister or husband's sister as a full surrogate, for sure, is an incest problem. Okay, you got that? But what's more subtle is that even gestational surrogacy might be an incest problem. Meaning, this is an interesting question. Even if husband's sperm is fertilizing his wife's egg, but if it's going to be carried by his mother-in-law, or by her sister, or by his sister, there is a potential for incest. But it's a little more questionable, because the sperm fertilized his wife's egg, but it's going to be carried by, right? So because of this, the Rabbanut does have two conditions on surrogates. Actually, maybe three conditions. The surrogate should be Jewish to avoid conversion problems. The surrogate should be single to avoid adultery problems. And the surrogate cannot be an incestuous relative of the husband to avoid incest problems. So an example would be, halacha would not allow the wife's mother or the husband's mother to be a surrogate. It would not allow the wife's sister or the husband's sister to be a surrogate. Okay? Because potentially that's incest. Again, it's easier to see the incest if it's a full surrogacy, where husband's sperm is fertilizing mother-in-law's egg, whatever it would be. But the truth of the matter is, even in a gestational surrogacy, you have those problems. Now, if those guidelines are followed, the rabbinate does allow here in Israel surrogacy. But there are some rabbis who actually, they're against the whole concept of surrogacy. They say it's very destructive to the family, that how do you have a husband and a wife and someone else is carrying their baby? Right? It's kind of destroys and interferes with the fabric. Some have even said, halachically, a woman is not allowed to get pregnant unless she's planning on raising the baby, because pregnancy is a dangerous medical condition. So the Torah allows it to have children. But if she's raising the children to give the child away, some have said she's not allowed to get pregnant. They say the whole idea of getting pregnant in order to give your child away is considered to be against halacha, because that is an endangerment, not for the sake of procreation. Okay, so these are some issues, but I didn't discuss some of the proofs. Next week I'll discuss the proofs of why we follow the birth mother. Today I just gave you a conclusion. Next week we'll look at some of the proofs, which are actually from the Chumash itself. Okay, any final questions? Alrighty, okay, you all be well. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week.